Alright, let's take a look at ambient occlusion. Um, it's a great way of getting sort of a GI skylit look without actually doing any of the skylight, GI ray tracing. Um, Skylighting is actually ray tracing, but it's not doing any of the bounces, and you are able to then have that information in the comp to kind of control separately. And it is a really great way of working. So let's take a look at how to set that up and how to actually use it correctly. So in this scene, I have a skylight, which we're going to use as our occlusion, or to generate our occlusion from. But first of all, what we have is just our key light and our teapot and plane again with our brick and bump textures. So let's render out a couple passes. One thing I want is I want a diffuse pass without lighting, and I'm going to display that. And I want just my key light. So I have the skylight turned off, and I'm just going to render these passes. Alright. So here's our diffuse and our key light there. And hold on one sec. Okay, I'm going to save these out, and we'll call this environment key, and this guy will be our diffuse. Alright, and now we need our ambient occlusion pass. So we can turn this guy off. In fact, we don't need it anymore. Turn off our key, turn on our skylight, and we'll go into the material. And again, we want to have white with the bump and no specular. So it's just like the channel lighting stuff, only, well, it's just like the channel lighting stuff. So let's go ahead and render this. This will be our occlusion pass. Okay, so here's our render. Now, some people, when they render occlusion passes, they'll change their background color to white, and they might be onto something. So let's render it both ways, with black and with white, and we'll compare the results in the comp and see which way actually works better and why. So let's save this one out. We'll call this occlusion black, and let's go to our environment, make the background white, and we'll render this again and save it out. So I'll just hit render. Alright, so now we've got our occlusion with white background. Let's save that out. And then finally, something I also see people do a lot is they'll take their whole scene and they'll just do an override material. It's a real easy way to get an occlusion pass, but what you're doing is basically taking out the bump information, because all you can really do if you're going to override your entire scene's materials is to put just a flat white shader on there. So instead of doing a material override, I'm basically just going to do it manually by turning off the bump, and all we have is just the flat white shader. And I'll render that out too, and we'll use that in the comp and see what that does for us. Alright, here's same render as an override material where there's no bump information. So we'll save that out, and we'll just call this one flat white. I'm not going to do one of these on a black background. I think we'll get the point from the other example. So the last thing that we need is, I'm going to turn this all back on. We need a control image. So we need to know what this would all look like if it was rendered straight out of Max anyways, so that we can have that to compare with. So I'll turn all my lights on here. And what I'm going to do with the skylight is I'm actually going to tint the color here, and I'm going to put in just a sky color. What we'll do is we'll just use this color and match it in Fusion with the ambient occlusion pass. So here's our sky color. We put that into the sky, and I'm going to render this for a control image. Alright, now our control image is all set, so we'll just save this out as control. And I believe we're ready to jump over into Fusion. Alright, we're over into Fusion now, and I've gone ahead and I've just pulled in all of the passes that we rendered out. And I also did one other thing. I created this color gain, and we're going to use this color gain so that we can match that same skylight blue color. So I just created this ahead of time. This is the equivalent of that blue color as far as red, green, and blue gain are concerned. So I just did that ahead of time so you don't have to watch that. So let's go ahead and start working with our occlusion. So let's see here. I've got a background which I made just kind of this bluish color. We've got our control image. So let's first of all just add these back together so that we can see it with our control. So what I'll do is we've got our diffuse, and we've got a few different occlusion passes to choose from here. Let's go ahead and we'll start with I'll start with the one that's on white. I think most people tend to render their occlusion on a white background, at least from what I've seen. So what we're going to do is, let's leave it over there. What we need to do is multiply these together. So bring in a merge, and we'll set it to multiply. Okay, and then to get the color, we're going to color tint the occlusion pass. So there, we've tinted it. We multiply it over, and the last thing we would do is add the key light. Change it. Alright, and now we should have exactly the same thing here. And let's just double check. Let's zoom way in here, and just so that it's a little bit clearer, I'm going to put all of this over that blue background. And I'll do the same for our control image. Okay, connect these up. Okay, see, alright. We're basically getting the correct lighting overall, but our edges are not working. What could it be? Well, we're multiplying, and I believe I mentioned earlier that when you multiply or screen, what's happening in Fusion is that Fusion is using the alpha channel kind of like a mask to control where those blend modes are actually happening. So what we need to do is disable the alpha, and then also make the alpha solid. Alright, and you just saw it change, see? Okay, so we fixed that, and now if we take a look at these, what do we get? It's still different. We still have a slight difference happening there. Alright, so oops, I hit the wrong thing, I'm sorry. That should have been make alpha solid. Now let's check and see if they're correct now. Okay, it looks like they're very close, but I think it's still a little bit different. Yep, you see it? A little bit different. Probably not going to be something that you'll notice, but again, it is different. So when this is motion blurred, you might see that. So that was on white. Let's try it on black. See what we get if we do this on black. Okay, so same exact setup, only with the black background, and if we compare these, now we still have the problem. Looks like pretty much the exact same problem. It's just slightly different. Okay, so we're gonna have to figure out how to fix that. But let's take a look at what we get with this guy. This is if we just override the whole scene, so there's no bump information. Let's just look at the difference. It's fairly subtle, and you might be able to get away with it in your shots. In fact, people do this all the time and get away with it, but you're not getting the nice subtle shadowing that you get with the bump map ones, bump map versions of the occlusion. So yes, you can do it that way, but it is better to have the bump information in there if you can. So that's kind of what we expected, I'm sure, but let's go back to using these black and white versions. Okay, so how can we fix those edges so that it's exactly the same? Well, the problem with this has got to be a pre-multiplying problem. As you can see, it's only happening around the alpha edges, and to me that just screams out that this is a pre-multiplying problem. So let's go ahead and let's isolate that and let's fix it. So what I'm going to do is we'll start with the diffuse and let's unpre-multiply it. So what I'm going to do, I'll switch this over to divide. We're going to divide by the alpha for the red, green, and blue, and the alpha channel itself will do nothing. Okay? And we're going to want to do the exact same thing over here. I'll just paste an instance of that. Okay. So this was the one rendered on black. We're unpre-multiplying it, coloring it, merging it on, and you know what? It's always been my experience that multiplying using the regular merge tool with this alpha issue, it's a lot easier to just multiply using a color or a channel boolean instead of this merge. So I've kind of just gotten in the habit of whenever I need to multiply passes, I actually do it with the channel boolean. So you can come in here and switch this to multiply and do nothing. Okay, so now we're multiplying this stuff. I know there's no alpha problem because I can tell it's not doing anything. Then we should probably do the same to our key pass. So I'm going to put one on there. So here's our key, unpre-multiplied, put it back together, and the last thing we need to do, now that they're all combined, is to post-multiply them. And now let's zoom in and see what we get. Okay, now they are exactly the same. So it was a pre-multiply issue. Now let's take a look at what happens if we plug the white background in there instead. Connect that up. Okay, here's the result of that and the control. We still have the problem. Check it out. Zoom way in. You see that slight little shift? Yep, still there, and that was by going through all the setup to try and correct it. So it turns out that rendering on a white background is actually not as good as rendering on the black. If you render on a black background and you follow channel booleans where you divide everything out and then multiply it back, then you get perfect results. So let's take a look. Put the black back in there. Okay, take a look at the edge. That's ours. That's the control. They are exactly identical. Alright, so occlusion passes on a black background is actually a little bit better. Alright, but before we move on, one thing I should point out though is that the way we created this occlusion pass was to go in and alter the diffuse and specular properties of our materials. Just like when we did the channel lighting, that's really not going to be a great way to do it in a production environment where you've got hundreds of materials. So what you need to do is find a way to override all the materials again, either via scripting or I mean, I don't even know how you would do that besides scripting. There's no tools that are built in that will automatically do that for you. So it's either a complete override like this, which wasn't as good a result as if you had the bumps. So how do you get that? Well, the easiest way to do this in a production sort of environment would actually be to do it the same way as we did with the channel lighting. So I actually rendered out just an ambient pass. Okay, this is the skylight by itself with a white light, and we can make an occlusion pass the exact same way we did the channel lighting stuff. So what I'll do, I'll get a boolean, let's connect these up, and what we're going to do is divide here. Alpha we're not going to do anything to, and I need to swap these inputs again. There you go, there's your occlusion pass. It's already unpremultiplied for you, and you didn't have to change anything in Max. All you did was you rendered out a pass with your textures and occlusion, and then a diffuse, and with that you can strip out all the texture information, keeping the bumps. Simple as can be, really. So this is probably a better way to get your occlusion passes when you're doing production. The other thing that's really great about doing it this way is what if you had objects that had opacity maps on them? If you were to do a global override, say goodbye to your opacity maps, but because you're working with the original textures and everything's set up exactly the same as you would normally have it to render the scene out, when you work this way, you keep all your alpha, all your opacities and everything. So you get your occlusion with bumps and opacities. It works great. Alright, now while we're working with this, I'd like to point out one more thing before we move on. Something I see a lot of people do, and it's not, I mean, it's fine, it gives you the result you want, but it's not correct as it could be. It's the way people use their ambient occlusion pass. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of recreate a setup I see a lot of people do. Let's see, we need the key. I'm just going to copy a couple of these passes over here. We need these. Okay. A lot of times I'll see people, they'll take their diffuse pass here. Yeah, I want this guy too, actually. Okay, so they've got their, let's say this was their ambient lighting pass. So they tint it to whatever color they want, even if there was some subtle shadows or something in here, that this is a fairly typical lighting pass. And then I see them merge their other lighting passes on top of that. And then at the end, they multiply the occlusion over top of all of this. Okay, and forget the edges and all that stuff right now, but this is the kind of setup that I see done a lot, where the occlusion is being done last, and this is really not correct. This is what's happening when you do this is you're actually occluding, you're using what should be ambient occlusion, you're occluding just the ambient part of the light, but because you're doing it on top of all your other lighting passes, you're occluding it out of the key as well, and it should not be done that way. The way that this should be done is the ambient occlusion only occludes the ambient portion of the lighting. So here's the, I have this turned off. Here's the sort of, I guess, incorrect way, even though if it gives you the result you want, then that's fine. But I'm going to flip these around, and you see the difference that it makes. We're no longer occluding the key light, and it just brings back a lot more depth and three-dimensionality to the render. So when you're using ambient occlusion, occlude just your ambient light. Alright, so how do you create an occlusion pass? We saw one way of doing it with Scanline, using a skylight with a white color and just overriding our materials, or not overriding, but changing the properties of our materials. That's one way to do it, but with all the different renderers out there, there's actually quite a few ways to do this. So let's take a look at some of them. What you saw just now was the skylight version, but let's switch over to Brazil, and all I did was use a script that changes me to the Brazil render. I'm using an older version of Brazil, but still same setup even in the newer versions. What we do is we go to the render pass controls, turn on enable, and what we want is a white plaster. And what's great about Brazil is it gives you this option to preserve the bump maps. So you can have this on or off, and it'll keep your original material's bump maps or not. So then all you would do is go turn on skylight, make it white. If you don't have any reason for transparent shadows, like if you don't have opacity maps in your scene, turn this off. This will slow your render down a lot, even if you don't have that stuff in your scene. So uncheck this guy all the time unless you absolutely need it. Okay, so we've got our white plaster, preserve bump map, skylights on. So one thing I want to check though, I want to make sure that my spotlight is off. Okay, so we'll go ahead and render that. Alright, so here's our Brazil render with the preserve bump maps turned on, and we'll just have a perfect occlusion pass there. You can do the same thing with it turned off, and that'll just turn the bump maps off. And finally, the last way that you can do it is to use a custom material, and you just create a white shader and drop it in there, and there you go. You can override all the objects in your scene, and this will be the same thing. It won't have bump maps or opacity or anything like that. So it is actually better to do the white plaster with preserved bump maps if you can. So that's Brazil. Let's go ahead and we'll switch over to Mental Ray. Mental Ray's got some cool options in here. With Mental Ray, you can do a material override as well. You would create an occlusion shader and just drop it in here, and that does pretty much the same as Brazil did. It just overrides every material in your scene. So let's make a Mental Ray shader for this. The way I like to do it is to use a Mental Ray material. Again, I'm in an older version of Max, so even in the newer versions you can still do it this way, and I actually probably still would. With the new architecture and design materials, you can actually turn occlusion on in your shader, but I'm not a fan of doing it that way, but doesn't matter, you can still do it that way. So one way of doing occlusion shader is to go into the surface and choose ambient reflective occlusion. So now here's your occlusion shader, and you can just take this whole thing and instance it into there, and then you've got your controls in here for it. So let's just use the default settings here, and let's render that out and see what we get. Alright, seems to work just fine. The only thing I'm noticing is that it's very grainy, and the way to control that is to adjust these samples, so we can kick it up and render it out again. And that'll just help get rid of that grain. The other thing to take a look at in here is the the spread. The defaults are actually pretty good here, but if you wanted to get it even more accurate, you could go up to 0.99, and then the light is really kind of spreading out evenly in all directions. With 0.75, it's kind of focusing it a little bit. It's still pretty diffuse, but when it sends rays out, it's kind of not really caring about the ones that might go directly to the side or almost directly to the side, and it's fine. The default values here are pretty good. The max distance is a real nice one. Right now it's set to 0, which basically means it's off. as soon as you raise this value, then it's going to look and say if any ray goes beyond this certain distance, I'm just going to stop calculating. And this can be great. This can help a lot in scenes that are really big and you don't really need the rays to go flying all over the place. Once it hits a certain point, it'll just stop calculating it altogether and it'll speed up your renders quite a bit. The other thing that can be really nice is this return occlusion in alpha. If you turn this off, then it'll give you your occlusion pass in your alpha channel. Right now we don't have it, but I'll turn it on and we'll just render this again real quick. Alright, so here's that render, and if we check the alpha channel, oh, that's lovely. It's in the alpha channel as well. Why it's doing this? Good question. I don't know. But anyways, here you've got the occlusion working just fine. So let's look at another option for dirt map, or I'm sorry, occlusion map. Creating ambient occlusion is to use a dirt map shader. So instead of this ambient occlusion one, there is the dirt map. Dirt map you're going to have to go and download. It doesn't come directly with 3D Studio, but it's free to download and you can install it. So we will discard the old. So now we're using the dirt map, and what's really cool about the dirt map is that this can be used for interior scenes. It's not really looking at light so much. What it's doing is figuring out where dirt would sort of collect. So it ray traces through the scene, but it's really looking at where the corners are, and it's shading things based on, you know, the angle in which two faces meet each other. So what we have in here is this probe geometry, which is important. You're going to want that on. And then same as before, you've got your samples, and this far clip is really important. Let's just render it as it is now so you can see the default settings. Alright, sweet. The default values here give you absolutely nothing. So we need to go in here and change the defaults. I'm going to turn these guys off and we'll try that again. Okay, that's better. So now we're getting occlusion pass at least, but you'll notice it's only, you know, really shading things, you know, in this tight little area around the corners, and that's all because of this far clip. So if we raise this value, let's just make it a lot bigger. We'll go to 100, render again. Okay, now it's starting to really spread out, and we're getting a look that's kind of similar to the other one. But like I said, what's awesome about this using the shader is that this can be done on an interior scene, and so you can get some really nice sort of you know, almost GI looking renders by using this pass. And again, the samples, same as the other one. Raising this will get rid of the grain. The ray spread, same as the other one. It just controls the angle at which these rays can kind of go out into the scene. And that's about it for mental ray. You can do it this way, and then there's also, if you wanted to, you could do some kind of scripting where all of your materials got an override. That way any of your bump or displacement or any of these other slots in your original materials would stay, and you wouldn't lose those, and just the surface part would be overridden. But again, that requires some scripting to do that. So finally, let's switch over to V-Ray and look at the way V-Ray does this. Now with V-Ray, you have this override material again. It works exactly the same as Metal Rays and Brazil's override material. All you would do is create, you know, a flat shader and instance it in there, and you're pretty much good to go as far as the materials are concerned. In order to set up the lighting for that, the way I like to do it, there's a couple ways you can do it, but one way is this way, and make your environment color white, multiplier of 1, and go into the indirect illumination, and we don't want any secondary bounces. Ambient occlusion is not GI, so there's no secondary bounces. And then I like to use brute force. It'll give you the most accurate results. So we've got our override, brute force. We should be good to go. Let's render that out. Alright, there you go. The brute force method is going to give you the best, shadow details, but if you're looking for speed, then the irradiance map is actually extremely fast, and you can tweak all these values to whatever you want. But on a simple scene like this, I think the low preset's probably fine, as long as you're just doing stills and not animating. So here's just an alternate way of doing it. It's much smoother and rendered a lot faster, so perfect for a still. And then finally, there's another way that you can do it. Turn off the indirect illumination altogether. We don't need this guy. And we'll do it kind of like we did with Scanline. V-Ray has a light type. Let me put this out here, called a dome, and it's basically the exact same as this skylight was in Scanline, but this is just V-Ray's version of it. Change the multiplier to 1, color is fine, casting shadows, that's all good, and we should be fine, so let's go ahead and render that. Oop, I overlooked one setting. We want it to be invisible, so you can see it starting to show up back there. So make it invisible and then render it. And here it comes. This is basically giving us the exact same results as the brute force method we were just using a minute ago. So this is just another way to do it where you could actually control it with a light if you wanted to. In order to get rid of the grain, you can adjust the subdivs here, or there's other ways of controlling grain in V-Ray, which Chris Nichols talks a lot about in his Nomenology tutorial, and I highly recommend checking that out. But this is how you would render out an occlusion pass out of V-Ray. So in all of the renders that we just checked out, Brazil really kind of had a nice setup where you could just override with a white plaster and it would respect the bump maps from your original materials, and that's really great. The other renders don't have that sort of option, so go Brazil. But really, I think kind of like when we were looking at earlier in this chapter of ambient occlusion and the channel lighting, really the best way to deal with this in production is to just render a skylight with all your textures and everything, and just turn off the specular and the light, and then do the divide, that Boolean divide trick in the comp, and that ends up getting you something that you can use a lot easier than creating occlusion passes like this, where you might have to go in and custom set up things or create scripts to override things. It's just much easier to do that channel Boolean trick